Hey there, Blockheads. My name is Taylor Martin. I'm the director of the sailing school here at Pewaukee Lake. We're in Pewaukee, Wisconsin today with this 420. We're going to take a look at a lot of the different attachments and the ring-dings and the pins and the bits and pieces that go to holding this 420 together and things to look for before we go sailing. Now, all of these 420s might be set up a little bit differently, so yours might look different than ours. We're going to take a look at the way ours are set up and know that you might do things a little bit differently where you're from, but this is a way that works really well for us. And right now, this Club 420 is set up for scholastic sailing because we're in the middle of our high school sailing program with the Milwaukee Youth Sailing Team that also practices here at Pewaukee Yacht Club, which means that there are no trap lines and no spinnaker rigging on it right now. And while the Club 420 is designed to be a super simple boat, even with the club rigging on it, right now it's even more simple because it doesn't have any of our club rigging. And we're going to take a look at the different bits and pieces on our 420 that can go wrong, that you need to take a look at every time you go out sailing, and figure out how we can prevent issues on the water. So we're going to start kind of at bow to stern. So all the way up here we have the chain plate on the bow where our forestay and our jib and our bow shackle all attached to the boat. So from the start we have kind of three different attachments here for really three different reasons. We have our jib pin, which is going to be thicker than your forestay pin. This is our 1/4-inch pin compared to our 3/16 pin. And that's because when we're on the water, our forestay doesn't do much. Our forestay is designed to hold up the mast when we're on land, whereas our jib pin is designed to run through that jib wire, which is what's under load when you're actually sailing. And your jib pin can look like this with your pin and your ring, but it can also look like this, which is just a quick pin, a little bit simpler to get in and out. You're not having to take your ring ding off each time. Now we have our bow shackle here, which we use, again, typically when we're on land or on dock to hold the boat. It can be used for short distances of low-speed towing, but as a coach, when you're towing for longer distances or at higher speed, you tend to have a couple of different methods for that. Now, while we're up here, we want to take a look at a couple of different things. We want to make sure that, first of all of these rings are still good to be used, that none of them are opened up too much, that they're all still pretty tight. None of them are going to snag on things. Both these rings look pretty good. We also want to take a look at the pins. Pins wear out a little bit more slowly than the rings are going to wear out. But we want to make sure that you don't see any fatigue or stress in the metal here. None of them are actually bent in half, anything like that. We also want to take a look at this fitting on the bow where we have our forestay and our jib attached. And you want to make sure that where it bends to attach to the deck itself, again, you don't see any stress or any fatigue. And you see some cracking on the bow here of the gel coat that we see actually throughout the boat. And this cracking, we don't have to be too concerned about. Gel coat does crack unless you know that you've hit something or that there is an injury to the boat. Typically, gel coat just cracks with age. The big thing is that this fitting here is still seated to the deck and is not loose anywhere. And then these machine screws that go into the bow aren't loose or aren't stripped or aren't cracked in any visible way. We can also see here that these two sides aren't perfectly parallel. And as long as we can get our pins in all the way through and the rings attached, and again, as long as the metal isn't too stressed from bending, we don't have to be too concerned that these aren't perfectly parallel. It's thin metal. It can be a little bit flexible. It's okay that it bends a little bit while we're working on the boat. Moving a little bit back in the boat, we get to our mast here. And our mast, we have a couple of different fittings that we have to take a look at. We have all of these fittings that are riveted on. The rivet you want to take a look at every time you're inspecting it. You just want to make sure that you're looking at a couple of different things to see that the rivet is still sound. You want to look at the head of the rivet here and make sure that this flange that's on the rivet itself isn't damaged in any way, isn't pulled up, and still has a good seat to whatever fitting it is attached to. You also want to make sure that there's no wiggle in or out with the rivet. You also want to take a look and make sure that the rivet isn't actually wiggling back and forth in the hole. What happens is that those holes tend to oval out a little bit the more and more loose those rivets become. But we want to make sure that these rivets aren't either missing or spinning in there or loose in any way. And again, just making sure that these fittings, this gooseneck fitting, this Cunningham eye, are seated pretty well to the boat here. These rivets are something that are pretty easy to replace, are designed to wear out before the fitting does. So you want to take a look at those. While we're here at the boom, we have our gooseneck fitting. And the gooseneck fitting is one of the more complicated parts of the boat because we've got a lot of different things going on. We have this part where it's attached to the mast itself. Then we have our block, a couple of pins, and then this fitting is actually riveted to the boom. Again, wherever you have rivets, you want to check to make sure that the rivets are still sound. Wherever you have pins, you want to check to make sure that the rings are still attached, that the pins aren't fatigued. And here we have a quick pin, and you want to make sure that this quick pin is actually all the way seated. And this quick pin, because it's under a lot of load and tends to spin in here, can wear out. So checking that from time to time. If you're traveling with your boat, you do check that. If you're not traveling, taking it out every once in a while to check is great. Going down into the boat here, we got a couple of other fittings we have to check. We have the tang on the vang here, which is riveted on, that we have to make sure, again, those rivets are sound. And same with the block for the purchase of the jib halyard, that we have to make sure those rivets are sound. Both of these are key parts of the boat that if they fail, it is critical while you're sailing. And so you want to make sure while you're on shore that those are good, and that the block is good, and that the rivets are good. And this cleat, both of these cleats here are actually just tapped into the mast typically. And so those are a thing that can fail. This is just thin aluminum. These are stainless steel machine screws. And you want to make sure that those are still pretty tight in there and that those threads on the tap haven't worn out. While we're down here, we want to take a look at all of these blocks and all of these knots on this cascading vang. There's a lot going on this type of vang. So a couple of different places to check. You check all of these blocks, you check all of your knots. They all tend to be bowlines, which are pretty easy to make sure that they're correct. And while we're down here, you can take a look at both this gasket for the centerboard, which you want to make sure is not too old, and this one's pretty old and cracked, but this washer here is still seated and still has some silicone there, and so we know that water isn't going to come in the boat from that point. But again, this is a part of the boat that's designed to wear out. It's just a rubber gasket, so you can take a look at that, make sure you're not leaking water in. So while we're down here, we can take a look at our mast step here. And this mast step is a really high load point in the boat. So we want to make sure that this is still attached, still screwed to the bottom of the boat, and isn't spread open too much for the mast to pop out. There's a pin in there, but the wider this mast step is, the more chance you have of movement from side to side or fore and aft. While we're down here in the bottom of the boat here, we want to make sure that all three of these cleats are still, the teeth are still good enough to hold this line, and that this line itself is actually even the right diameter for these cleats. These cleats do wear out from time to time depending on the age of your boat, and typically you can tell as you're using them when they start to get worn down because they don't hold the line as well as they used to. And again, this is a part of the boat that you interact with often, and while it's not critical if it fails on the water, it is kind of annoying if your centerboard won't stay up or down or your vang won't stay tight. You also want to check to make sure, again, you have a machine screw and a bolt or nut at the bottom. You want to make sure that this is still attached pretty well, and this fair lead back here, these do tend to crack out from time to time. They're pretty simple to replace, but you want to make sure that this is still attached to your boat. Now we come to the traveler bar where your main sheet is attached here, and we have a couple of different things to check on this main sheet assembly. We have our shackles at the top, and we actually have two different types of shackles here. We have a screw-in shackle and a shackle with a pin and a ring here. They're both acceptable, but if we're using a shackle with a pin and a ring, we typically want to see this ring taped to the shackle so it doesn't snag anywhere on this main sheet. We also want to make sure that these attachments to the boom are still attached to the boat. We want to make sure that this bolt with the nylock nut here is still on, that the nylock is still seated in that nut and they're not loose. We also want to check these blocks, all of these micro blocks here for the main sheet to make sure that those bearings aren't worn out in any spot. And especially if you're sailing in a high sand or high saltwater environment, you want to make sure that those get rinsed and lubricated as necessary, and that this plastic isn't cracked anywhere. And down here on the traveler bar, we have a couple of other places where we have machine screws and nylock nuts. We want to make sure that those screws, especially right here on this eye, where you get a lot of load on the traveler bar, are still seated all the way through. If these get loose, this can be a sign that your traveler bar is getting loose, though it is attached in a couple of different spots. And again, we have another example of a ring ding that's actually been taped down here, and while it's not beautiful, I know that this probably won't snag on my main sheet, even though there is a fair bit of rubbing right there. All the way back here, we have this spring for our big ratchet block on our main sheet, and under here we have ring dings and another shackle and another pin. And this is a pretty annoying part to get to with our spring still attached, so keeping an eye on that to make sure that you only have to replace one piece at a time and not have to reassemble the whole thing. This spring does wear out from time to time, so making sure that it's still good. And again, a part of the boat you interact with a lot, so you typically recognize when it starts to go bad. While we're here on the hiking straps, we can see that we have our hiking strap tied to our traveler bar, and this is actually tied pretty well. You've got some thinner line that's been both tied on and also crimped on with these hog rings. And you want to make sure that this isn't so tight that you can't wiggle back and forth with it, but also not so loose that it's halfway to the floor. And I like the way that this hiking strap is attached here. All the way forward on this hiking strap, we have another place where it bolts to the thwart up here with a little bit of a plate and some more machine screws up here. This is a place where you have something that's cloth or fiber interacting with metal, and tends to be a place where things can wear out. So taking a look at that so those hiking straps don't fail while you're sailing. And while we're here on the side of the boat, we want to take a look at one of the more important parts of what holds our mast up, which is our chain plate and these pins and rings and how it attaches to the deck here. So this is actually all the way taped up, which is good when we're sailing, not so good when I'm trying to inspect it. And so every once in a while, it's good to pull this tape off. I actually can't tell if there's a ring in here right now. And having a ring in there is super key to keep this pin in place. I would assume there is, but you want to check every once in a while under your tape. And if you sail your own boat for a Club 420 often, you'd know the last time you taped this up. But you want to make sure that, again, pin and ring, that your ring is good and that your pin is not bent or fatigued at all. And while we're here with this wire, you want to make sure that the wire isn't frayed anywhere, isn't coming out at the way bottom here, and isn't bent or kinked in any place. You also want to check that this fitting that goes through the hull is still attached to the boat. And same with the bow, you want to make sure that it's still seated, that these 3 machine screws here are still have their 3 corresponding nuts on the bottom. And there's a bar that goes underneath the rail of the boat here that those actually bolt to, that you can check every once in a while. Typically, unless you've replaced this, that should be good from the factory. So at the back of the boat here, we want to make sure that our lines and our bungees that attach to the hiking straps are again in good enough shape. Right now we have this line, this red line, which actually is what holds the load of the hiking straps, comes all the way back here to this eye. And again, we have some screws into the fiberglass on this eye. Another thing that you want to make sure is seated onto the boat and not loose. And you also want to make sure that this line isn't wearing out. When you have fiber that interacts with metal, you tend to get the metal that cuts through the line. And so this is a piece that wears out more often than other parts of the boat. So making sure that this is still tied on and that the line isn't getting cut through by this eye right here. We also have this bungee which goes all the way back, and right now is a little bit loose, so it could be tightened up. And we have this bungee tied back here, so I can use these knots to adjust the tension on it as this bungee wears out, another thing that's designed to wear out. Knots don't hold super well in bungees. You have a couple of different types of knots that you can use that hold reasonably in bungees. You can also use hog rings like we had on the hiking straps up on the tie downs up there. Bungee is something that you want to check anywhere where you have bungee in the boat, like we do here on the tennis ball plug and like we do here on the hiking straps, and a couple of other places when this is actually club rigged. Bungee wears out pretty quickly. This cover isn't super UV resistant. The bungee itself isn't super UV or salt resistant. So checking those tend to wear out. Also checking your plug fittings, making sure that those are still seated pretty well and still sealed. And you can also take a look at your plugs and make sure that these gaskets, these rubber gaskets here, are not worn out. Again, anywhere where you have rubber, you have a piece that can be designed to wear out over time, could need to be replaced. We have our pigeon or pintle attachments here that go all the way through the back of the boat. Those tend to not wear out super quickly, but you can take a look at those anywhere where you have something that's just spinning in the hull of the boat. You might need to take a look at it. These are all still pretty well attached. You can see the nylock for our clip is still seated there. And our last thing to check here before we go out on the water is our tiller and our rudder and where it attaches to the boat. And again, this is something you interact with more than other parts of the boat. And so typically you can tell when things are starting to go wrong back here. But you want to check your universal to make sure that the rubber here in the universal isn't worn out. These tend to wear out pretty quickly if they're under a lot of use, especially in a salt or sand environment. And while on the rudder here we have another cleat and another bit of line, and this cleat, you want to make sure that the teeth are still sound and still usable and still hold the line. But this cleat isn't one that is critical if it fails on the water, because we have a couple of other tools that we can use to tie this downhaul line down. And again, we have bungee back here with hog rings, another place that you want to check to make sure that this bungee is still usable. And wherever we have fiber interacting with metal, you want to make sure that it's not wearing out too quickly there. Back here, we have a lot of fittings on our rudder. These tend to wear out the most slowly of anything because they're tapped into the spacers here. But you want to make sure, especially on our rudder, that this bolt where the rudder pivots is still attached, that this nylock is still seated. And you can actually see there's a little plastic gasket or friction ring here that you want to make sure is still in there, because this rudder can get a little bit loose in the rudder head and it can get a lot more friction, wear out this fiberglass pretty quickly if this little ring in here, this little washer in here, is no longer there. And finally, you want to make sure that both your pintles and your gudgeons are still in good condition back here. These are, again, more machine screws, more bolts, and more nylock. And on the boat itself, like we checked from the inside, you want to make sure that all of these bolts and nuts are still seated. And you can see a little bit of wear taking place on the pintle here. You can kind of see on the bottom looks a little better. Something to check, these take years to wear out. But this part down here, the clip that actually holds the rudder in the boat, these do tend to wear out a little bit more quickly. You're pressing on them every day. They're thin metal that's designed to be under a little bit of load. And you can see that they're designed to be pulled out and replaced. So making sure that this still holds your rudder in the boat. And finally, we have our tennis ball plug. They do come from the factory with your tennis ball like this, but you want to make sure, again, you have bungee. You want to make sure that's not worn out, that this knot back here, or however it's attached to your boat, is still attached. We have a little washer here again. You have fiber and metal interacting, making sure that it's not cutting through the bungee. And then finally, that your tennis ball plug still seats to the hull. Last set of rivets we want to check on the boom here are where the outhaul attaches, and this rivet is an eye that actually gets a lot more dynamic use than any of the rest of the rivets on the boat. So this is one that's a little bit harder to tell if the rivet is still attached, because this does spin in there a lot of the time. But you want to check that this rivet is still good, and again, we have the line running through it, making sure that it's not wearing out too quickly. So one more thing that you want to check on a Club 420 is the auto baler here at the bottom of the boat. There are a couple of different ways that an auto baler can go wrong. The first one is the way it's actually attached to the boat. Like everything else, we have these bolts and these nylock nuts. And if those are still seated, then you should be fine on those. But there are also a couple of gaskets on these auto balers. There is an internal gasket, and there's also this external gasket that seats along where the auto baler sits in the hull. Typically, that's kind of hard to tell when it's going bad, but you'll see water coming in either around the edges or inside on the internal part of the gasket here. We also want to make sure that if you're sailing in a saltwater or a sandy environment, that this flap here that actually opens up when the auto baler is fully open isn't jammed stuck. And you also want to make sure that your handle is still in good condition. And I know I say that there's no handle actually on this auto baler, that we just have a piece of line here. If you're on the water, that's a super quick way to fix this auto baler. That handle is really just to pull the auto baler up. The line might hurt your hand a little bit more than the handle does, but make sure that your handle is still attached pretty well to that auto baler. Well, there you have it. For a 14-foot boat, there's a lot of things going on. A lot of those things you do interact with every day, like your tiller extension and your lines. A lot of the things you don't interact with. And so you want to make sure before you go sailing that you're taking a good look at all of the different parts of your boat and making sure they're going to sail. Thank you guys for watching.